Good afternoon. I think we are live. Welcome to the webinar for COVID-19 in public libraries, hosted by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. So we're just going to give everybody a moment to join us. While we're waiting, if you can say hello and tell us where you're from. And you can type that directly in the chat. I'm Mikhail, and I'm your moderator today, and I work at Belleville Area District Library as a youth service librarian in Belleville, Michigan. Our tech support is provided today by Chandra Walker, who is the interim director of University Library, associate director for instructional and research services, and associate professor of library science at Georgia College. Okay. And again, you're tuning in to the webinar for COVID-19 in public libraries using virtual classes to continue serving our patrons. And today our panelists are Brandy McNeil, Associate Director for Adult Literacy, and Mikhail, Valentin, Technology Training Coordinator. They are both employed at the New York Public Library. Brandy also serves on the PLA Board of Directors, and she is Executive Board Member for BACALA. And so today they're going to talk to us all about how we can best help to provide services to our patrons in this current time.
Thank you, Mikhail. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump in because we do have a lot that we want to cover with this. So I hope everybody is home and safe, and let's jump in. So just so you guys see, that's us. If you would like, you can follow us on Twitter. It's @_Brandy McNeil, or for Twitter for Mikhail, it's Mikhail Valentin, and that's our Twitter handles. And you'll see that at the bottom of the screen as we go through the presentation. And so I wanted to start off by kind of commenting and showing something that President Obama had stated. He had said the internet is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And I think this has been true since the start of this COVID-19 pandemic. I know in New York, what we have seen is that children and parents were scrambling to get internet connection and laptops for their children so that they can just continue to do what they need to do online. I know some adults who needed to work from home had to scramble, because if you've got one laptop and your child needs to use the laptop in order to do classwork, then how are you doing your work? And so you can tell that there's this necessity, and it shouldn't be something that is a luxury. And you can also see the inequity in speed of internet service, and it just goes on and on and on. And so I know that this is something that I hope this reality will start to improve. So what can we do as public library systems? I think the very first thing we should think about when thinking about virtual platforms and what we should use in order to provide services to our patrons is to not recreate the wheel, and not try to provide all of your services in every single way that you can virtually. I think it should be about what can you do that's temporary for now, that gives people access to things, and what's easy, quick, and reliable. And so we will go through a lot of the different platforms that are out there just so that people at least know, and you guys can make some kind of informed choices for yourselves. We are in no way endorsing any of these products, so it's just about making sure that you guys know what the options are. So some things to think about in terms of what I've seen done so far is things about quick wins versus needs thought. And so I think some of the quick wins that I've seen done is that people will change up their websites right away for their library systems and then have e-resources at the front of it, right? So you might have ebooks, you might want to put your databases at the forefront, online resources in terms of kind of virtual platforms, because we do tech education, we focus a lot on that. And so on the front of our website, we wanted to make sure that people could get to online resources to still continue their classes. And so things like digitallearn.org or GCF Learn Free, those types of websites are really valuable in this time, because people are scrambling, looking for things. People are trying to figure out how do they actually use technology while trying to learn the technology. And so you want some good, easy methods that have been built kind of for our patrons that kind of help them. And so those are just an example of two, but there are tons of them out there. If you can, put your handout materials on your websites. That's another way to kind of help out and really help people to get access to things that they're going to need. YouTube playlists, create some of those. Those are a good idea, because you might not have a certain platform available to you or certain software. So let's say it's Slack, maybe your library system isn't using Slack, but people are scrambling trying to figure out how can they use Slack. If you create a YouTube playlist, that might give them the ability to see like, oh, okay, you guys vetted this. This might be a good website for me to be able to learn how to use it. And then the last is to have a chat or a way for people to phone in their questions. Those to me are like quick wins that people can do. But I think when you start talking about virtual platforms, those are things that need more thought. And the reason why is because there's so many different criteria that you need to think about when you're gonna say, okay, we're gonna do something, but we're gonna do it virtually. And so we're gonna talk about those. So to start off, you want to think about the ease of use for your patrons and for your staff. And that means, can they go ahead and just click and get onto the platform? Are they going to need to download something? Do they need to understand how to connect their audio or connect video? These are some of the things you want to think about when thinking about the ease of use for your patrons. The next is going to be the audience, who you're trying to reach. You know, every location is different, especially if you're in a rural area. So are you trying to reach beginner level patrons who really don't understand technology too well? And so if they don't, that will affect which platform you decide to get on. Also, are you trying to gain new patrons? That'll affect maybe what you put up on your website. So you want to think about that. The size. As we walk through later on in the presentation, as we walk through the different platforms, you'll definitely need to know how many people can actually be on one platform at a time, depending on the choices you make, right? And that can be dependent upon whether you decide to use a free version of it or a paid version of it, and what's the maximum capacity that you'll be able to have. In addition, you're going to want to think about the duration. And so some classes might be lecture-based, and it could be 45 minutes. Maybe it'll be 60, 90, 120. What you want to think about, though, is can you keep someone's attention for that long on a computer? And so you want to make sure that if you're doing something that is going to be 2 hours, is it interactive? Are you maybe popping up and showing a video? What are you doing to kind of keep people engaged? Are you going to be polling and asking questions? Things like that, that will keep them engaged for that 2 hour time span. So you want to make sure you're thinking about that type of stuff. Also, you might want to think about staffing, right? In your staffing, it's about how many staff do you already have and how many of them actually need to be trained. Because if this is a new software for every single person, then how are you going to get everybody staffed up so that you can actually offer your services on this particular platform? And so I think that is a crucial thing to think about. This is where you're going to need to figure out if you're recommending maybe YouTube tutorials. Is there someone at your library system that might be able to create a video for staff so that they can understand what they're going to need to do to use that platform? How can you really focus on getting them trained up and quickly? And then, do they have what they need? So you also want to think about laptops with cameras. Do they have speakers? Do they need speakers? And that will also affect your ability and your choices in the platform you choose. Next up is, I think, the biggest one, which is privacy. So privacy is going to be, in terms of the criteria you're going to think about, you're going to want to know what are your library's policies. And how do they feel about maybe people's names showing, right? When you use something like a Google Hangout, it's going to show a name. Is that okay with your library's policies that people see names versus other platforms where it might just say viewer? So you want to make sure that you understand very clearly what the policies are for your library system. And you want to be careful because you don't want any what we call quote unquote bad actors where people might have a name that might be something discriminatory or something to that effect. So how can you combat things like that? Also, if you decide to use a platform, making sure that it's going to be okay that people's faces are shown, right? So do you want something where people cannot see people's faces, or is it okay for people to see that, right? I think when you're thinking about maybe like a series-based program where you know that people were going to see people anyway over a duration of time, it's okay to think about, okay, yeah, maybe we can go ahead and show people's faces and names. But if this is maybe a one-off type of situation and people would not normally share this information, you would want to think about how you can combat some of that. Also, just understanding, the difference between when you're using a free product versus using a paid product. I would say make sure you're reading a lot of those privacy policies by those different platforms, because once again, you want to make sure you're in line with what your library does. Accessibility, this is huge because depending on what you're using, if you're trying to provide information that's going to be accessible, you might have to add transcription later. Does the service provide transcription? And so you want to be cognizant of that. What are the ways that you can still provide that? The session type is going to be whether or not you're doing it live, whether you are pre-recording it and then posting it up. Are you going to archive it for later use? Are you not? Those are things you want to consider when you're thinking about the type of platform you're going to use, because you want to make sure that you can record. And if you do record, you can record the whole thing. You might have to think about, okay, whose signatures do you need to get if you decide to post this somewhere and archive it? So you want to think about what the session type might be. Next up, we have passive viewing. And so that really has to do with, what do you want that platform to do? Do you want people to be able to have the ability to do that kind of whole raise hand thing? Or do you just want them to be able to chat? Do you want them to have the ability to actually speak during a session? Which you might run into a lot of problems with that. You got to think about people who, especially your patrons, who might not understand how to use technology in a certain way, or understand that their microphone and everything that's going on in their house might be heard by everybody who's trying to be on the particular platform. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about that. So that polling, if you're trying to kind of ask questions because you're trying to gain a sense of where people's knowledge is or familiarity with something, you need to think about those things first so that you can decide whether a platform is going to be the right platform for you. Then you have whether or not your registration is going to be open to the public, or it's going to be, a private registration. And so this is pretty simple. You can use something like a Google form if you're using Drupal. I know a lot of library systems use Drupal. You might just have people sign up with their email. And then maybe at that point, once you have the names, you'll email them the link to your particular platform. Then I would say that testing and piloting the software is key. You want to make sure that before you make a final decision, you are doing thorough testing of that software. And what I mean by that is you should have everybody who needs to be involved in that decision testing it with you, if possible. And so that would be getting staff members that can possibly test. Are you able to reach out to patrons possibly that are dedicated, that you can reach out to, that'll say, yeah, I'll help you do that pilot. And then you're able to see kind of how they're able to handle the platform that you're choosing, right? Was it easy for them? Was it not? But get the real deal before you actually go live, and then everybody else is telling you, yeah, this was sucky. So you want to make sure that you're doing something like that. Okay. Last up on the criterias page is going to be these options. So languages. Do you want to offer classes in different languages? I know, or different programs in other languages. In New York, I know we like to offer things that are going to be in Spanish and Chinese. And so those are things that you might want to consider. And then promotion is big. So for us, it's about right now, like how can we use our social media? Can you create an e-newsletter if possible that might be able to go out to patrons who are already following you and kind of dedicated to you guys? Obviously, your website is going to be key. If it's possible, maybe you know somebody or somebody knows somebody at a local TV station, especially if you're in a smaller area, that might be possible, and they can get the word out for you that, hey, we're doing these programs using whatever the virtual platform is, and that would be a good way to ensure that people know that you guys are still out there servicing your communities while being closed to actually coming into your library systems. The other big thing is going to be communication. And I say this because you want to make sure that your patrons know exactly what's happening, and then your staff know what's happening. And so communication is going to be key. So you want to make sure that the communications is clear. What are the steps that they're to take? What are the next steps they are to take? If you're done with a pilot phase, making sure everybody understands, hey, we're done with the pilot. We're going to move into actually offering this for real. And so you want to make sure that you're providing good communication. And this is where, if at all possible, when I mentioned earlier about creating maybe like little video tutorials so that staff can understand how to do something, but if they don't, they have something they can go back to so that they can look and check and make sure. This is also something that you would throw into that communication. And then cost. Cost is going to be the big thing. Can you afford a certain platform? You'll see as Mikhail gets into the different platforms, you need to think about, okay, well, if I get something like Zoom, do I need Zoom meetings? Do I need Zoom webinars? Can I use a Zoom room? What is it that is actually what's needed? And then what is that cost going to be? And so you want to think about that and be strategic with it. I also think that you should think about, you know, if you have to pitch for why you might want to go with a platform that costs, you know, what are the benefits? Is this something that can be a long-term thing for the library system? And so, hey, yes, we're going to spend this money on this right now, but in the long run, we'll still be able to use it. And this is why, and being able to show that it's going to be of benefit. I think the other thing could be also where you say it's temporary funding, right? So it's just going to be for the next 2 or 3 months, hopefully. It'll be just for the next 2 or 3 months, and then it's not a ongoing cost. So some of those things are things you want to think about as you're thinking about the platform and maybe how you can get some buy-in for it. And then last is, what does success look like once you actually do this and you have the platform? Obviously success will, you know, we think about numbers and how many people showed up, but I also think it's about people saying that, oh, you know what, it was so easy to get onto the platform. That's going to be one of the key criteria. And so if at all possible, I would say survey the people that are attending your virtual session so that you can start to understand whether your platform is actually working for you or not. And it's going to be about asking the right questions. And so you guys can see that I did list some of the questions that you might want to think about, such as, you know, would they recommend this virtual class to someone else? How did they hear about it would be good, so that you can see if your promotion or marketing of your virtual classes is actually working. So next we have the different platform options. And so there are many. And the platforms are different types, right? You have broadcasting platforms, webinar platforms, meeting video conference platforms, and then you have some that are kind of a little different. And so when we were trying to figure out kind of our platform options, we actually went in and pretty much tested all of these different things so that we could determine what would be kind of the best platform for the types of things we were needing to do. And it might not work the best for every single department in your library system, right? It might be good for a particular type of thing that you're going to do versus somebody else who might need to do book discussions. And so we'll run through, and Mikhail's going to go through now some of those options.
Everybody. So building on what Brandy just said, I think the most important thing is to kind of narrow it down by context, right? there are different programs that we offer. Some classes, some are, story time options, right? And so I think before we went about actually testing everything, we did kind of think about how we would use these things. And it's important to note that all of these, like all the research that we did is in flux. As we were actually testing and doing research on this, a couple of platforms changed feature sets, a couple of platforms added stuff to their free tier. WebEx actually, because of COVID, made their kind of freemium tier, it bumped it up a bit, so it had more capability. And so I think it's important as you kind of go about this, when you're doing your research, to kind of stay organized and check, because things are always changing. So the first option is really kind of thinking about, or first category rather, is broadcasting platforms. The purpose of these is so that you have a large audience, usually over 100 people, so things like story time, and you're broadcasting. There's not so much of a communication between kind of participant and the broadcaster, although it is something that is possible. So one of the kind of criteria that we kind of were looking at when we were looking at all of the three kind of major broadcasting platforms, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Livestream, and YouTube, were kind of the ease of use. So these would be platforms that you'd want to use for things where, while you will have people that are able to chat, you're really having a captive audience that is going to kind of like listen in. I think the one interesting that we found while we were doing the research is that while Facebook Live and YouTube Live are free, Vimeo isn't. That's actually because Vimeo allows you to push to multiple platforms simultaneously. So with Vimeo Livestream, you're actually able to broadcast to Facebook Live and YouTube simultaneously, as well as Vimeo. And so you'll see, as we were going through kind of, this is just a chunk of our research, you'll see that while it doesn't have a free tier available, kind of the cost is worth it due to those other functionalities. Next slide. All right, so meeting software. The big kind of umbrella of software that's being used for the most part during this time are meeting softwares. Meeting softwares are distinguished from broadcasting software because they're meant to be collaborative. So GoToMeeting, Hangouts Meet, and Zoom are kind of the three biggest meeting softwares being used now across contexts. I mean, they're being used with anything from actual meetings in intra organization as well as extra. We're using Zoom now. That's kind of proof that it is a huge platform. The issues that we kind of wanted to narrow down as far as our users, because again, we were thinking about it within the context of providing classes, traditional classes, and making those online, were things like barriers for entry. So how hard is it going to be for someone to actually join the meeting? Do they need a code? Do they need a meeting number and a code? Do they have to call in order to hear the audio? Can they use it from their computer? Does it work on multiple devices? So you'll see it right here, we have barriers for entry, right? So for something like GoToMeeting, it requires a download and also requires you to kind of know your way around. Hangouts Meet was one of those situations where it was great. All you need is a Google username and you can kind of jump in, but then privacy became an issue with that. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with what's happening with Zoom right now. While they're kind of tamping down on some privacy issues, there were some vulnerabilities there that were a big problem, especially when dealing with, sensitive material. Other things that we were looking at were things like privacy in terms of, hey, can you see other people's names by default? When people are signing up for something, will their names be available? For all three of these, you will. Time of duration for the free or limited tier. So in most of these cases, there is a free tier of software that's available for use. In terms of Zoom, Zoom has like a 40-minute limit. Something like Hangouts Meet didn't really have a limit for the free tier. And then GoToMeeting is not applicable because their service just never had that type of limit on the free tier. Another thing that we also want to think about is things like active captioning. So active captioning is a bit confusing. As of now, a lot of these platforms are able to include active captioning if you have an external service, like a third party that can do it for you. So you'd usually pay for an external service, and then you can hook it into things like GoToMeeting and even Zoom. So far, the only tool that we've been able to find that actually does captioning in real time, and it's actually pretty useful, is Hangouts Meet. And that's because it uses a proprietary Google Live Translation software that's kind of built into it. The good thing is that we have found that there are certain workarounds. For example, that same software, that Google Live Translate software, is available as an app on phones. And someone could even, if they wanted to, place their phone next to the speaker on their computer, and then they can see the live transcription happening on their device. Granted, that introduces some other issues, right? So if you're looking at the transcription on your device, you're not going to be paying attention to what's happening on the screen. So it's a little bit tough. There are usually workarounds, but it's important to know what kind of features are available straight out the gate. And so the last one that's pretty big is kind of like the webinar and conference software. Keep it in mind that most of the meeting softwares can also be used as webinar software. Zoom makes a distinction between Zoom meeting and Zoom webinar, right? So Zoom webinar obviously has other capabilities and allows for more participants that are simply watching as opposed to kind of collaborating and showing their screens. Three really big ones that we looked into were WebEx Meetings, Adobe Connect, and Uber Conference. Again, issues that we're thinking about is things like active captioning. Are there breakout rooms, right? So something that's unique to the context of a webinar is that if you have a larger conversation, then you would want folks to be able to kind of break off into smaller sub conversations. And that capability is something that really distinguishes, I think, the webinar platforms from the regular meeting platforms. There are also some things that are just unique to certain platforms as well. So WebEx Meetings is pretty standard, so is Adobe Connect, but Uber Conference is actually a bit different because it has a sort of kind of gamified kind of environment set up to it that's really interesting. It's also visually very distinct, and it's important to note those things. If you know that a certain kind of your patrons are used to a certain level of kind of polish or color, or you think within your organization that people would kind of like something better aesthetically, then that's also something to consider. So outliers and special use cases. When all of this COVID stuff started happening, people were just throwing around names of different platforms. And in a lot of cases, they just assumed that those platforms could do what they wanted them to without kind of doing the research. And we've been hearing a lot about kind of Microsoft Teams and Google Classroom. And Remo is another one that's kind of recent. These are all great platforms, but what they do is really, really different. So in the context of Microsoft Teams, Teams is really for organizational kind of collaboration. It's for teams of people that need to collaborate with each other, right? You need to share docs, you have tasks. If I could kind of give it a comparison, it's kind of like if you took Asana and Slack and just kind of mash them together, right? It's not appropriate for things like public programs, right? Because not only would you have to pay for each account, but it really doesn't have the tool set that you would need to be able to really control what you needed to. The same goes for Google Classroom. Google Classroom is not the same as Google Hangouts Meet. Google Classroom is really a collection of apps that allows you to share things like learning materials, handouts, videos, to have tests and quizzes that are easy to grade. Those also require you to have emails with that domain to use within those classrooms. So if you have a class of say 20 folks, you'd have to create 20 emails for those people to be able to use Google Classroom for your program. In some cases, if there's some sort of flex with your account, it would have to be your Google Apps account. then maybe that wouldn't be an issue. But for a lot of folks who are paying by account or per account rather, it might not be the best option. Remo is another really interesting kind of gamified virtual conferencing platform that's a little more kind of like visually distinct from everything else. It's very similar if you have used something like Uber Conference before, but it also has a lot of other features that and buttons and bells and whistles that for most people they would find it highly complex, and they would also be a little confused. It can be busy at times.
Thank you, Mikhail. So the class topics you can think about, one of the things that we wanted to do is we're offering virtual programming that are classes that we typically would do, but then we started to think about what are some other things that people kind of need help navigating. And so you can think about things like getting groceries delivered, right? This is not maybe something that people were doing before, but now people are stuck at home, or you may have older people who don't want to go out or scared to go out. And so a good thing to do would be to get the groceries delivered. How do they do that? So offering classes such as that, how to navigate Zoom. There are so many people who are trying to use Zoom, but might not understand it. So that might be something good to have. People are home and they're trying to be creative. Starting their own podcast might be something that you might want to think about. Learning with lynda.com, especially if you're still using lynda.com at your library systems, might be something good. Obviously, we want to make sure people know how to download our ebooks from our different library systems. LinkedIn for job seekers, we are going to have a lot of people who are going to be looking for employment. And so that would definitely be one that you might want to throw out there. And then lastly, just using social media to stay connected while social distancing. So something that you might think about having is maybe you're going to do a TikTok, right? How to use TikTok and all those little quirks might be something that would be really good to teach people how to do. So that's just an example of some classes that you might want to think about, especially if you're doing programming that would be similar to us in terms of kind of tech instruction. So we did decide to start virtual classes, and we kind of want to share like what happened after that first pilot week. So we got a rating of 90%, where it was easy for people to sign up for our virtual classes and easy for them to log in. And that's because they didn't have to worry about needing to download anything to their computer. They click the link and they're into the conference. Also, it was pretty easy for them to ask questions through chat. The two things that were a little lower are enjoyed the online format and would sign up for another virtual class. And I think that's because when you really think about it, people who are used to going to in-person classes and people who really love in-person classes because of that social aspect, because they're able to see and do and ask questions right away, they still love that, right? This is just another type of format or platform. And so I completely understood why that number would be low. Hearing about your classes, right? So we know that people were hearing about our classes through our website, through word of mouth, and our newsletter, which are all good things. So you might want to think about how can you use that to leverage getting the word out as well. And then we had 100% of people that have said that they would recommend our virtual classes. So that showed us that this is something that is good. This is something that people do want, and we were getting some really good feedback for that. And then we also, in our survey, took demographic information because we wanted to kind of understand who are the people that are coming to these virtual classes, just so that we can understand how we might be able to target people better. And so that's just some of the examples of what we've seen thus far after week 1. We are now about to finish week 2, and we're already prepped up for week 3. So I would say things to remember is that, and I saw this on Facebook and I was like, I really like it, because nothing should go back to normal because normal wasn't working. And I think that we don't want to lose the lesson that we're gaining here, in that we are doing these virtual things because we were kind of forced to, but I think we should continue to probably implement these things. So if you do go back to, the way things used to be, I think you might want to still keep a portion of it where you are doing these virtual platforms, because if something else does happen, you don't want to have to be the one figuring out how do we start things back up again, or, oh, what platform did we use? Did they change anything on that platform? So as much as you can, if you're seeing success in your program with the virtual programs, I would say try to maintain some of it. It doesn't mean that you need to do it at the same large size, but I would say try to even reduce it and have some virtual programming that's happening and that continues to happen even after this pandemic is over. And now we'll take Q&A.
Okay, so there is a question for both of you from Zarisa Klein. And she says, the city of Austin requires that all video content we make is archivable. Is that a consideration you use when evaluating platforms and services? And were there any particularly good for that purpose?
You want to go ahead, Mikhail?
Yeah, so I mean, most of these platforms do allow for recording, and anything that you record, you can archive. Even if a platform doesn't allow you to record anything that you present, which most do at this point, you also have other ways of doing that, right? You can basically just record your screen using any amount of utilities. I'm on a MacBook Pro and I use something called ScreenFlow whenever I need to do a tutorial that will capture not only the audio from the material on my desktop, but it can also record any sort of voiceover. And so that's how I would go about it. We did think about whether or not we wanted to record. That wasn't a huge consideration on our part.
Yeah, for us, because we are actually doing our classes live and they're virtual, and it's about the people who, and because they are one-off, and it's about those people's experiences with that instructor for those classes at that moment, we wanted to make sure that, it was just for that. Now, if the way we're kind of trying to work our accessibility portion of it is if someone lets us know, so we have like a thing where people can contact the library system and let us know like, hey, I'd like to join this, is it accessible or can you make it accessible? Then we will record it and make sure that we have transcription for that particular person for that particular class.
Okay, we had another question about if the slides, if you were able to make the slides available, and also asking if there will be a tape version of this Zoom event available.
Yeah, from what I understand, they're going to make the this recording available, and we can provide BCLA with the slides.
All right. Next question is, what about the controversy about privacy regarding Zoom? I don't know if there's a more specific question to that or if that's just in general.
Yeah, I think we might need something just a little more specific to understand what about it. I mean, I think one of the things is that we have seen that depending on the type of platform that you use with Zoom will actually depend on whether that Zoom bombing happens.
Yes, that's what she's talking. Okay, so Veronica just typed in. And
okay.
She said, Zoom bombing and hackers getting into networks.
Yeah. So what we've seen is that if you actually have the, and quote me if I'm wrong, Chandra, I believe it's if you have the webinars version, you actually have controls that will allow you to kind of control and avoid that from happening. And so I think that Zoom is trying to make some corrections with that. And so yeah, that's pretty much all I know at the moment in terms of.
Yeah. Just to chime in, Brandy, Zoom has a lot of different settings that you can use to give different permissions to attendees. And I think probably when everyone got started on this journey, everybody just kind of jumped in and was focused on providing content to people and facilitating meetings. And what we saw was an exploitation of no one ever envisioned that this Zoom bombing thing would happen. But there are some features that you can use to restrict access, to keep people from sharing their screens, to keep people from taking over the mic and those types of things. And so Zoom is really fast at work on those. And then, of course, there are some features that were already built in that maybe people just weren't using, that people have started to use more now. Also requiring registration for Zoom meetings, because previously I think people were just setting up Zooms that you could just hop in without having to register and posting that information publicly. So anyone who got the link could join. And so now the recommendation is to have people to register in advance, so you get an idea about who's coming, and you people aren't just kind of dropping in from anywhere. So good question though.
Okay. So another question is about a Google Classroom account. So for the Google Classroom account setup, do you mean that each attendee has to have a Google account, or is that the person hosting the session has to set up separate emails for each attendees?
Every attendee. So the way that Google Classroom works, it's really for organizations like schools. That's why a lot of schools like K through 12 use it, and they're paying for their domain. So you have to have an account on that specific domain in order to participate and to administer Google Classrooms. The way that it works with the Google Suite of Apps is that your administrator, who's your Google admin, would turn that feature on or off for your network, and then the people in that network would have the access to those classes, and you can enroll people that way. But yeah, that was one of the things that kind of shocked me when I was doing my research, because I was like, oh, let's just use this. And I was like, oh no, we can't do that. Because that would make it so that we would have to pay for all of these email accounts, these Google accounts for our patrons, and our patrons are just way too many to do that for.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
I see there's one more about how to reach out to those without computers, tablets, or smartphones. And I think for that would be, once again, if you're able to get the word out to through television, like I said, if you know anybody locally, maybe even a radio station that can do a blast for you. I think that's the method that I can think of to kind of get the word out so that people start to know. I have also seen that people are putting signs up on their library doors so that if people walk by, they can see that they are doing something and that they should try to see if they can get a hold of something to do that. We have also been putting the word out so that people can tell other people in terms of about services that are being offered from the city or from cable providers about free internet for 2 to 3 months so that they're able to get online.
Okay, I'm just kind of strolling through the chat to see if there were questions in there that I missed, but if anyone has any more questions, you can type those in the Q&A section. And Veronica mentioned that this has been very helpful, because she said we've been building the airplane while flying it.
We sure are.
Yeah, yep. I think that's what most of us are doing.
Okay, so here's another question. Hi, has there been any discussion regarding printing from a particular platform while at home, or simple copy pasting type of function?
Are we talking about printing shared materials or kind of class materials? Just a little bit of additional context would be helpful. I don't know what we're talking about with printing. Things like class handouts or resources that we'd be giving patrons in person?
So let's just say you are talking about the last way that Mikhail just mentioned. I know that for a lot of the sessions we're doing, we had already had all of our materials are up on our NYPL website, and so people can always get any handouts from any of the classes that we do. However, like I said, there are new classes that we're thinking about, and so what we've been doing is trying to kind of rush to get handouts that are PDF versions that we create. And we are putting like screenshots of the steps that we're taking so that people are able to use that. In addition, I know one of the things that we're doing is also, and this is not related to that question itself, but trying to offer classes for people who use smartphones or tablets. And that's because at least we know through the iPhone, the screen record function does allow you to choose from several different virtual platform options. And so you can basically show the screen on your tablet or your iPhone to people. And so if you were doing classes like that, or if you had something on your device, you would be able to actually, broadcast and show that as well.
Okay.
PDF, okay, yeah.
Awesome.
That was it. And we have another question. I appreciated your advice to getting colleagues' eyes on software before going live. Did you have them testing at home and on site in the past? And that's a good question, because I did a Facebook Live story time and my screen, it just kept freezing up on me. Mm-hmm. And it was like, how could I troubleshoot that ahead of time?
Right. So what we were having our staff test while at home. And then, but I think here's what's important to know. Nothing is probably going to go as perfect as you think it is. And there will be flaws. I think if as much as possible out the gate, if you can let your patrons know, like, hey, we're piloting this, we're testing it out, so that they're not overly angry that like, oh my God, you didn't get it right the first time. Like, what are we doing? And I think that really helped us because, like we had one instance where for whatever reason, it could have been the audio in the person's house. It worked earlier when they were doing some of the sessions, but then for whatever reason, when it was time to do it, it wasn't working that well. And so we just rescheduled that session and told the patrons like, hey, we'll make sure that you guys can get into the session, again, and you get first dibs on it. So that's kind of how we've been solving some of that. But, I just want to make sure that you caveat everything with like, it might not go, as smooth, and there's not going to be any, technical issues. There might be some.
Building on that, thinking about things like time, right? So one of the things that people don't realize is that the network, even if you have really great internet and you're paying for, however many hundreds of megabytes of data a month, at certain times of the day, there's going to be congestion because everybody is watching or streaming something, right? So around like 5, 6 o'clock, usually you'll notice if you do a speed test on your machine, your internet is going to be a little bit slower. And that's because people are so used to their biorhythm is they come home, they turn on the TV or they turn on a streaming service. And so in the instance that Brandy mentioned where it was working earlier and then later it didn't work, that could have also been a factor as well. So it's important to kind of test across different times in a different context. I see there's another question about different devices, and that's also something that you have to think about as well, right? Like It was very important for us specifically because we know that a lot of our patrons have tablets or phones and not necessarily computers. And if they do have computers, some of them don't want to deal with them because they're too hard or confusing for them, right? We have a whole generation of folks that, people expect students that are kind of like younger to be digital natives, but some of them are just on their phone most of the time, right? So the software that we ended up choosing, it was a big and important thing for us to kind of make sure that it was easily accessible regardless of what device they were using.
And that's one of the things that when we were testing things out, we were testing out, okay, how does it look on your smartphone? Okay, well, how does it, because somebody would have an iPhone or somebody would have a Microsoft Surface tablet and then somebody else had an Android device. And so we were testing it out, like saying, okay, everybody get on. and let's all do this together, so that somebody would be like the host of a session, and then we'd all jump in and we touch and click and try everything. That's how like we started to figure out like, oh my God, wait, that means a patron might be able to do that and jump into a session. You know, if they were using something like a Google Hangout Meet, oh my God, somebody click present. Now we see their screen. That's not what we're supposed to see, because, right, depending on once again, the type of platform that you either pay for or not pay for. If you're doing the free version, you might not have control over like those types of features. And so just being mindful of that. And so testing as much as possible with as many devices as possible is the best thing you can do.
Yeah. I see another question about, it's from Ellender Shirley. How well are the public libraries accommodating the university, college, and school-age students? All classes are 100% online this quarter. Online study sessions, online ebooks, textbooks, extension. Just share some of the programs offered. I know at our organization is actually partnered with an external vendor for providing online study sessions for folks.
Yeah, we're doing online too with Brainfuse. So I know that they've made that available. I know that, and we're not necessarily working with a lot of people who do that, but I think there is something that NYPL is offering to ensure that some of the vendors are giving access to some of the other books that they might not necessarily have, but in ebook format. I did see some emails come out about that, where we have more books in ebook format for them.
Chandra, could you type in the name of the company you said you were working with?
Oh, you want me to type in the name of the company?
Yeah, if you could type that
Okay.
in, so everyone could see
Yeah.
that. Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, so if we don't have any more questions from anyone, we'd like to thank Mikhail. Did I say your name incorrectly?
Okay, it's Mikhail. Yeah.
Mikhail and Brandy for sharing with us today. Did we get, oh no, this is the same question I was going to say. Did we get another question here?
Yeah, I think we got them all as I'm looking through it.
I think that's it. We would like to thank you for joining us for the COVID-19 Public Libraries webinar. And you will have access to this again, so stay tuned to find it on YouTube, and we will also have it posted up on Facebook. So just give us a little bit of time, and then you can access that again. And then I think they have both shared their information. So if you wanted to reach out and had any more questions for Brandy or Mikhail, you can do that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.